Today's topic will be how organizations learn. And our presenter will be Erika Maclaughlin. Now, a bit about her. Erika has worked in IDEV as an evaluation officer and previously an evaluation coordinator for 4 years. She has about 7 to 8 years of experience working in evaluation and policy research, both with international financial institutions and with the Government of Canada. Over this time, she has evaluated programs and policies across a range of subject matters, from international development to human resource to non-proliferation of weapons of mass. Most recently, she worked on a country strategy and program evaluation for Ghana and Zambia, and IDEV's evaluation of the bank's human resource management direction. Her professional interests lie in the use of evaluation as a management tool, sustainable private sector development, and the evaluation of organizational systems. Her favorite aspect of working in evaluation are the constant change in subject matter and the chance to impart knowledge from multiple disciplines, innovate and solve complex problems. Now, webinar, a series of ground rules. As she presents, she will stop at the key point slides and welcome a few questions. However, if your questions are not answered, getting to the end, we will have about 20 or 30 minutes where we will address all of them. Now, you will notice that the webinar software has a chat box. You can be keying in your questions where we will aggregate them and then address them systematically at the end of the seminar. So without any further ado, I will then introduce Erika. Thank you.
Okay. So hello, everybody. Good morning and welcome to IDEV's second self-learning session. This is the first session that we've held that's open to the evaluation community of practice. And these seminars, the set of seminars was established to share knowledge both within the bank across the evaluation community and outside the bank to complement the training that's already available throughout the institution. So as was said in the introduction, I think one of the best things about evaluation is the ability to bring knowledge from other disciplines to look at a problem with a fresh perspective. And in this case, we're discussing learning organizations and how organizations learn. This is a really relevant topic because, in fact, it's among our commitments for ADF 18 to make the bank a learning organization. So we're going to talk a little bit about what that entails, bringing in theoretical perspectives from industrial and organizational psychology and also management sciences. So part of the idea is that we can organize ourselves a little bit differently, or we have to organize ourselves a little bit differently if we want to seek organizational learning as opposed to just learning among individuals. So really, what does organizational learning mean? What does it require? And what does that require of us in planning our activities? So we'll proceed by going through the perspectives, defining a few key terms so we're all on the same page. And I'm going to highlight the key points and pause for some questions after each section. So hold on to your questions until that time. I'll let you know when we're going to get started with that. So also, I note that because we have people joining from the bank and also from other organizations working in different contexts, at the end of our discussion, what I would like to do is have you discuss your perspective. What are some of the challenges that you see in influencing organizational behavior in your role and in accessing evaluative knowledge to make decisions and to change how you personally do business? So it's a good opportunity to share perspectives from different areas of the bank and also different organizations. So without further ado, let's get started. Oops. Okay, so as I said previously, the objective of this is to discuss two perspectives on how organizations learn. So the first is Quasson's 4I framework for organizational learning, and the second is Argyris's double loop learning. Now, the Argyris article is a little bit older. It's from 1977. but it's still relevant today. It just shows that good ideas don't necessarily have an expiration date. And it's an interesting context because it talks about a genuine business as opposed to an IFI, but a lot of what we do operates on the same principles. So secondly, we're going to discuss these perspectives in terms of the creation of an evaluative culture. So we're discussing these perspectives, in terms of the creation of an evaluative culture. And really, we need to discuss what this means. In IDEV's 2013 to 2017 strategy, creation of an evaluation culture or an evaluative culture within the bank and among RMCs is one of our strategic objectives. However, you'll note we never really define it. We seem to understand implicitly what this means, but we need to make it explicit in order to identify the best way to achieve this objective. So one of the major conclusions of the presentation is that we need to organize ourselves for organizational learning because it's different from individual learning. It has different requirements and it's expressed differently. So this is one of the things that we will need to consider going forward. And hopefully in our discussion at the end, I'd like to discuss really how we can bring this from the theoretical to the concrete. So first, to provide a little bit of a background, evaluation in the bank is carried out from two different perspectives. The first is self-evaluation, and the second is independent evaluation. Now, self-evaluation involves any kind of monitoring or reporting that is performed by the individuals who are directly responsible for an initiative, for the performance and the implementation of an initiative. For example, we monitor and supervise the implementation of projects, and this eventually feeds into a project completion report. This is a self-evaluation activity. Independent evaluation is monitoring that occurs outside of the management structure of an initiative. So, for example, in IDEV, our performance is not in any way tied to the performance of the evaluand or the thing being evaluated. And on top of that, too, we report directly to the board. So there's no management structure that influences our findings. We're independent. Now, evaluation is also increasingly regarded as a tool for learning and reform. A lot of people see it just as an accountability mechanism, but this is really not the case. We identify lessons from evaluation so that we can change how we implement our business activities on an ongoing basis. So this is really what underpins learning and evaluation culture, and evaluation can be leveraged for this objective. Increasingly, it's among our strategic objectives, and it is among the strategic objectives of IDEV's independent evaluation strategy. So typically, in the bank context, I know not everybody is logging in from the bank, but within the African Development Bank, we typically promote learning through platforms such as events, databases, publications. But one of the key messages of this presentation is, depending on the type of learning you're trying to achieve, these may not be the most effective mechanisms. This may not be the most effective approach. So in some cases, we might need to consider how to do things a bit differently. And so, yes. Now, just to move to some of the strategic outcomes of IDEV's evaluation strategy to help you better understand our context. The three things that we try to achieve through our 2013 and 2017 strategy are, first, to promote accountability. So let's define this so we're all on the same page. This is ensuring that activities are implemented systematically and in compliance with established standards. So this can be a policy or a directive, or it can also be monitoring our progress against the things that we commit for ourselves. What are our targets? What are the outcomes that we've identified? Have we achieved them? So this is promoting accountability. Promoting learning. In the context of an organization, we learn in order to achieve an objective. So as an individual, you can subjectively learn something and think, oh, that's pretty neat. I might follow up on that, I might not. You learn it, you have it as knowledge. But in an organization, that knowledge needs to lead to action. So we're defining learning here as promoting a change in behavior to improve progress towards organizational goals or objectives. In this context, learning is not necessarily complete unless it results in a change in how somebody approaches a certain situation. And finally, building an evaluative culture. So we monitor activities and we collect information to assess our performance. An evaluative culture is when this occurs systematically. So we systematically collect information about what we're doing and analyze our performance, and then we adjust how we operate. We adjust bit by bit. With each adjustment, we try to learn how to do our actions a little bit to improve our performance and improve progress toward our strategic objectives. So when this occurs as a cycle within an organization, just as a way of management, we've moved a little bit closer toward an evaluative culture. So the fundamental takeaway, of course, is that the outcome of learning is a change in behavior. And we're not talking, I need to define this a little bit more. When we say behavior, we're talking about the way in which an animal or a person behaves in response to a particular situation or stimulus. It's an observable action. It's different from your personality or your temperament. So it's not internally how you conduct yourself or how you conduct yourself with others. It's when you are in a situation, you're more likely to act one way or another, just to very clearly define what we mean by behavior. So first, I'm going to move into our first model, and that is Quasson's 4I model of organizational learning. This is from organizational and industrial psychology. So this model proposes that learning occurs at different levels within an organization. So an organization, you have the organization as a whole, but you also have internal structures, and learning can occur among these internal structures as well, and it looks a little bit different. So you can have an individual who learns, who comes across some knowledge and maybe thinks, okay, that's interesting, I might act on that, I might not. You also have learning among a group. So a group of individuals can get together and talk about something that's happening in their context and agree to act in one way or another. And then you have learning across the whole organization. Now, the difference between these groups is that as you move from the individual to the organization, what you're seeking is a shared understanding. But achieving that shared understanding becomes a little bit more complex depending on the group that you're talking about. So with an individual, it's just the one person. They observe their environment, they learn something about their environment, they decide to act on it in a certain way. A group of individuals, however, would have to sit down and come to a common understanding about how they're going to address a certain situation in future. This, again, it's a bit more complicated, but it's relatively feasible. At the level of a complex organization, taking the bank, for example, which has 2,000 people working for it, or more than that now, this learning typically occurs through a more formal process because, again, you have to ensure the consistency of the behavior across an organization. So, as an example, an individual might attend an event and say the information is interesting, I'm going to incorporate this next time I design a project or next time I work on a strategy. A group may sit down and say, we've identified an interesting lesson, say a sector group as an example. They sit down and say, we've learned something interesting. Project. So as a group, let's discuss what this means and we agree to do this from now on. But in an organization, it's much more complex. So it tends to be more formal, such as changes in policies, changes in directives, formal rules for how the organization operates. It gives us a shared understanding of what needs to be done. And yes, it gives us a shared understanding of what needs to be done, and everybody understands that they need to act the same way. So there's a uniformity to it. Now, of course, in a group or in an organization, you can also have people, like not everybody acting in the same way, but this isn't necessarily learning as a group or as an organization. It's just a group of individuals. So learning occurs through 4 processes in this model. First, there's intuition, and this is unique to individuals. An individual may regard some kind of relationship in the environment. Say, for example, projects in this country tend to face a lot of delays before effectiveness. So they intuit and they interpret it in their context. What is it about this country that makes projects makes it difficult to have projects reach effectiveness for first disbursement, for example. So they can decide, when they decide the cause, say there's a parliamentary process which requires ratification of a loan, they can choose to integrate that into their activities. So say we're going to start the parliamentary process before a project goes to the board. Groups can do this too. Groups can't intuit, but they can discuss and interpret together and decide as a group to integrate a practice into their work. But at the organizational level, we have something a little bit unique: institutionalization. And again, institutionalization is the process of using this knowledge to change behavior among all members of the organization, demonstrating a shared understanding. And this tends to be, again, done through formal processes because it's the most effective way to do so. So let's move on to the next slide. Now, information can move from the individuals to the organization through processes called feedforward and feedback. So an individual might share information with their group, the group decides to act in a certain way, evidence accumulates before management takes a decision that pushes all individuals to change behavior and incorporates this knowledge. So this is knowledge feeding forward to the organization. However, when formal decisions are made, whether they're based on feedback and feed-forward information or some other source of information, individuals also have to learn as they adapt to the new requirements of their organization. And Crossan describes this as a tension, a constant tension between exploitation and exploration. So with exploitation, we're taking what we already know and what we're already doing and trying to make it better. But exploration is deciding that we're going to do things a little bit differently and really change how we're operating, change our behavior in the context of an organization. And you can see how these processes begin to form a cycle. So in the continuous collection of information and transfer of information to improve what we're already doing and identify new ways of doing things is part of an evaluative culture. So this constant continuation of feed-forward and feedback learning. So this is the first theoretical perspective we're going to discuss. Now we're going to move on to something a little bit different and provides a slightly different perspective. And that is double loop learning. So double loop learning, you'll recall from the article, it was in a different context, but one really important way of describing this, one really good metaphor, is that of a thermostat. So for a thermostat in a room, somebody has set the temperature. It's going to be 72 degrees in this room. The single feedback loop process is where the thermostat adjusts, maybe heating up the room where it becomes too cold and turning off when the room starts to become too warm. But it never questions whether it's the right temperature. The double feedback loop process, this is akin to strategic renewal in an organization, makes that question. So do we have the right temperature? Are we doing the right thing, considering what we want to achieve and also our context? So in the single feedback loop, it's mostly linked to operations compliance and correcting errors. So how can we do what we're already supposed to do a little bit better and monitoring against existing standards? The double feedback loop process is more linked to strategic renewal and identifying or adjusting operational practices that everybody's going to follow. And a key part of this is adjusting to the environment. So for a good example of this actually is the high fives and the DBDM. So considering our operating environment, we've decided a new set of priorities, a new business delivery and development model. And this is just a fundamental change in how we're going to do business to achieve our objectives. This is based on evidence, hopefully. So this is an example of a double feedback loop process in an organization. A single feedback loop process, a good example might be the PCR, the entire monitoring process over the project cycle. So we look at our requirements. Are we in compliance with our requirements like environmental and social safeguards? Have we achieved the outcomes that we've set out to achieve? Have we have we set out to achieve what we've intended to achieve, and also have we complied with the necessary timelines? So did we disperse when we want to disperse? I'm just being told for people outside of the bank, I should explain what PCR is. This is a project completion report. So it's a report of implementation after the project implementation has been complete. Okay. So yes, in this example, I want to take this and build on it to try to illustrate some of the questions that we might ask in different processes. So in a single loop learning process, we might ask, how can we better comply with our requirements? So as I said, for example, how can we better integrate environmental and social safeguards into project design and project implementation? How can we perform better against our current objectives? This is the kind of question you would ask in a single loop learning process. In a double loop learning process, you might ask, are we doing the right things given our context? And how should we change our existing practices and standards to improve results? When you look at double loop learning, you're able to look at a broader range of questions because you are questioning how you make decisions and also the model with which you choose to operate. And a good example of this is procurement in the bank. So when we work with different projects, different countries, we have a procurement framework for that country. We have two options. We can go project by project and try to build the capacity of the people who are just working on that project, as we do with environmental and social safeguards too. Or we can go by the country level. What is the country system? How can we best support the country system? What are the weaknesses and what can we use this system for? So it's two different perspectives, two different models. And in a double feedback loop learning, you're not just implementing what you've already decided to do, you're questioning whether what you've decided to do is still relevant. And this is in the article, it's linked to a manufacturing process. So you've decided to produce this product. Are you producing it well? Are you producing it efficiently, on budget? Are you improving sales? On the other hand, you might question whether you're actually producing the right product to begin with. So in my own article, I tried to take these two perspectives and link them to the bank's context and the evaluation system. So on one hand, the single loop feedback process is akin to the project cycle. So we develop projects against certain standards. We have certain procedures we need to follow, and we monitor implementation throughout the project cycle. At the end, we assess the results that we've achieved and we identify lessons so we can follow that same framework and maybe achieve better results. And so this is akin to what we do in the self-evaluation system. And this can be both for projects, but also for people responsible for implementing corporate policies, as an example. So we have operation monitoring against existing standards. We assess our performance, and where we're starting to run into errors, we adjust course as required. And we identify relevant lessons for similar operations so that we can do better next time. Independent evaluation is more closely tied to the policy cycle and to double feedback learning. So we can verify operations monitoring and performance and the information from that process. We can identify lessons from multiple projects and interventions, identifying general factors that contribute to success or failure of different operations. And we also assess interventions in their environment. So we say, this is the model that we've chosen to work with now. But is this the right model given our context, given the change in our operating environment? Can we do something differently? What are other people doing? So it's a different type of inquiry. And so here is the first stage that I'm going to stop to address some questions and comments. These are the key points that I want you to remember here. First, the outcome of learning is a change in behavior, particularly in the context of organizations. So in an organization, everything that you do is meant to achieve a certain organizational objective, the way that you do business. And this needs to be reflected in a concrete action. If you learn something and you think it's interesting, but you never apply it, it doesn't necessarily contribute one way or another to the achievement of the organization's objectives. So secondly, in organizations, learning occurs among different groups of stakeholders for different purposes. So on one hand, on the single loop or self-evaluation project cycle related learning, we have how can we do our work better? On the other hand, we can question how should we do our work differently? And as we move from individual learning to group learning to organizational learning, things become a little bit more formal because fundamentally we need to generate a shared understanding of how we're going to do business, how we're going to use evidence to change how we do business going forward. And finally, ideally, knowledge transfer should be continuous. So we have this continuous cycle of exploitation where we take what we're already doing and try to do it better, and exploration where we change things a little bit and we implement our activities with a new behavior and try again to adjust to make this process as strong as possible. So the shared understanding is really an important thing. So among organizations, part of the reason that it is typically expressed through more formal means, such as changes to policies, changes to directives, is because we need to generate this shared understanding of how we do business. So I'm going to take some time now just to address some questions. Okay.
Focus on.
So I've unmuted everybody. Does anybody have a question they want to share?
Required for reporting and monitoring project. It's very key. And what are the essential things?
I'm sorry, I can't hear.
So I should try to understand that in terms of accuracy, timing.
I'm very sorry. We just unmuted.
Well,
so I haven't been able to hear your question.
Then I mentioned what's my challenge in terms of my certificate. So he told me not to worry about that, but let's get it started and sort of that later time. Yeah.
Okay.
Mm.
Can you get the question?
Yeah.
Okay, I'm muting. So we're having a few problems just with being able to talk and express the questions. So can somebody please write in a question in the chat function and we'll take it up and address it that way. I think this will work a little bit better. So please, if you have a question, please just write it in the chat function for me. Where is the chat function? Can I see the questions? I need the questions so I can answer them. Okay, so I'm being told there's no questions at this point. So I guess we will go on with the rest of the presentation. Oh, here we go. Chat 6. So what is the role of the organization in promoting learning, allowing failure versus reaching business objectives? This is a really, really good question, and it's something that I very much am going to address in the self-evaluation and independent evaluation section of this presentation. So as we'll discuss in the next slides, one of the risks is that certain types of inquiry are less likely to be able to identify failure. You're less likely to be able to, I guess, how can I say this? There are disincentives built into the organization for raising the flag and saying something is not working as we expect. Certain types of evaluative inquiry are just not well suited to that because they're within the management chain. So we will address this in the coming slides when we talk about the difference between self-evaluation and independent evaluation. But I think the key message there is that, look, if you want an evaluative culture and you want a culture of results, which is something that we're trying to promote right now, it's not about achieving results every time. It's not about achieving your objectives every time. It's about being comfortable with recognizing and identifying failure and fundamentally learning from it so you can do better. If you're performing perfectly all the time, if you're always delivering results, you're not questioning what you're doing. So, and you're missing a lot of opportunities. We should start seeing this as an opportunity more than anything else. Okay, so I'm going to go on with the rest of the slides unless there's any more questions to address. Okay. So now this will address some of your questions regarding failure as we go through this slide. So what I want to discuss now are the implications for evaluation. So as I mentioned, we have two different evaluation functions, two different routes through which evaluation takes place in the bank: the self-evaluation function and the independent evaluation function, as two knowledge and lesson generating activities. So what I really want to demonstrate with this slide is that, you know, a lot of people think that these functions contradict each other, that they conflict with one another, but they're really quite complementary. So the strengths of one function balance out the weaknesses of the other. So first, let's look at the self-evaluation function. So as I mentioned before, this is evaluation carried out by the individuals who are responsible for implementing an initiative. So lessons from this type of inquiry influence project identification and design. They also influence the activities that we undertake in supervision and in dialogue. So the strengths of self-evaluation, say for example, when we do a project completion report in terms of organizational learning. So we have the people involved have in-depth knowledge of the history and the context of an initiative. They know everything that has happened from design to implementation to completion. And they're able to bring that knowledge into the process. There's also greater buy-in among the stakeholders involved. So because the people who are conducting the evaluation are also the people who implement it, they have a lot of incentive, I guess, a lot of drive to identify lessons and also to incorporate them into their next activities. So use of evaluation is very important for the function itself. That's our objective. So when you have greater buy-in among the stakeholders and they're willing to use the information, that's a really good thing for learning and for changing behavior. However, insights are often context specific. And this is not just within the bank. You can also look at the evaluations of the self-evaluation function in the World Bank and in the IMF. The insights are often context specific, so it's difficult sometimes to apply them more generally to the activities of an organization. And finally, this is where our question came up. There are disincentives for identifying failures. As we saw in the double loop learning article, sometimes, you know, there can be consequences for you if you try to make management or senior management aware that something is not working. They might question whether you've done something wrong and might make your life a little bit difficult. So there are often disincentives for people to say, you know, I think something just is not working with this. We've done everything we can, but I'm sorry, it's just not working. So it's not that self-evaluation is necessarily unobjective, but there are just a lot of incentives for it to be less objective. So this is one of the key problems, because as I said, if you want a culture of results, it's not just about achieving results or achieving your results every time. It's about looking at what you're trying to achieve and identifying critically what is not working and learning from that to do better. You can't learn unless something hasn't quite worked out. So next, we're going to discuss the independent evaluation function. And you'll notice that the strength of this function is it kind of balances out the weaknesses of the self-evaluation function. So as independent evaluators, we're less familiar with the history and the context of an initiative. We have to really do our research and learn about it, and there might be some information that we miss. And there's also potentially less buy-in. You know, sometimes people just fundamentally don't agree with our recommendations, or they might be inclined to defend what they've already done. So we have to really work with our stakeholders in order to get them to use the information. And that's critical for our own results, as I said. Evaluative knowledge needs to be used. However, relative to the self-evaluation function, we can look at issues over a range of operations and identify more broadly what the conditions for success or failure might be. So we identify broad factors that help us do our work well. But also, we can also look at things outside the current operational structure. So we can look at it in context. What do our comparators do, for example? How has the context changed, and is what we do still relevant? And finally, because our KPIs have nothing to do with the performance of the evaluand and we're not within the management structure, notionally independent evaluation is a bit more objective. So in terms of what we influence, independent evaluation is well placed to influence policy and strategic direction, and also the decision-making schema of an organization. So just to wrap this part up, what I want to say is that self-evaluation and independent evaluation are complementary. So both functions can contribute to learning at either the individual level, the group level, or the organizational level. But self-evaluation is more closely linked to single loop learning over the project cycle. Independent evaluation is more closely linked to double loop learning over the policy cycle. And finally, another key point that I want you to consider, and this is something as well that the IMF has observed as well as the World Bank, independent evaluation can enhance the credibility of self-evaluation. We know that with self-evaluation, there are incentives not to be objective. If the findings of independent evaluation support self-evaluation, it enhances the credibility of that function and also the credibility of the institution. So sometimes, in fact, we have stakeholders identify our recommendations and say, we're already planning to do this. And my response to them is, good, we don't have to disagree. If we support what you're doing, it probably means that there's a lot of good evidence to support it. So just another way to look at these two complementary functions within the bank. And finally, the second takeaway, key points to remember. And I'll take some questions at this point. But fundamentally, learning depends on context. Access to knowledge, so you have to consider the stakeholder, who's going to use the knowledge that you're generating? How do they access it, and when do they need to access this knowledge in order to change their behavior? What opportunities do they have to apply the knowledge? And what incentives do they have to apply the knowledge? And incentives, as we said, are particularly important in the context of self-evaluation and objectivity. So you have to consider not just the knowledge that you've generated, but also who's going to use it, how, when do they need it, how are they going to change their behavior as a result. So before we move on, does anybody have any questions for me?
Olivier has a question.
Yes. Yes. We addressed this question. We addressed this question in the last section, but I guess we can discuss it a little bit more now, unless somebody has another question that they want to. I think it's a pretty okay. I think that's pretty limited, and it's. This is focusing on the individual. So yes, you need, I won't comment on the division between staff and managers, but really what we want to talk about is organizations. People are not the only group that, like, individuals are not the only group that need to learn. Fundamentally, you need to start thinking about groups and organizations and how we can change our behavior collectively on a broader scale. So I would say that it's not a valid assumption. It's pretty limited, but also part of the problem is that we need to stop thinking about learning as just a domain among individuals. We need to start looking at other options. Does anybody have another question? Okay, I'm being told we can't hear the questions. We've only actually received one. And as I just said, I once read that training and learning are for staff and development is for managers. Is this a valid assumption? And I've just said that I think it's pretty limited, and it just considers the individual. It doesn't consider the needs of an organization. Does anybody else have a question that they need to that they would like addressed? Okay. So then I'm going to continue on to the next part. This is the final part. So now, one of the things I'd like to demonstrate when we're talking about organizations, this is how we typically organize a learning activity. So we've produced some knowledge, like an evaluation report. For example, we've identified some lessons from the evaluation report, and we decide we want to share it. So let's say we have an event. Say, for example, we just did a private sector synthesis and we had an event to share some of that knowledge. But how is the knowledge used? There are some uncertainties in this approach. If we start with the product that we've produced and then we decide we're going to share it through a number of channels, how is it used? What change in behavior is it going to generate? So these are some of the questions we might ask ourselves. How do we know that this knowledge is going to be used? How do we know that we've reached the right stakeholders? Do they access the knowledge at a time when it makes a difference to them in their activities? And what incentives do they have to change their behavior in response to this knowledge? These are some key questions that we need to ask. So just as an example, we did the private sector synthesis. We have a private sector event. It's attended by maybe different task managers, by different people in government, by some decision makers. But really fundamentally, how is it going to be used? An event might be a good way to target an individual so that when they're implementing their activities at a later stage, say designing a project, they might say, I came across a really good idea in this event and I'm going to implement it into my work. But is it a good way to change behavior in organizations? It can happen, but it's not quite as certain. So this is the model that we typically use to try to impart knowledge and change behavior. And the key takeaway is that it might not be beneficial in every setting. The second model that I want to propose is a little bit different. So organizing ourselves to change behavior on a broader scale. So the first step is maybe we should think about identifying the behavior that we want to change. How do we want to change behavior? We have to consider whose behavior we want to change. Who are the users of the information? Whose behavior do we want to influence? And when does the knowledge need to be shared? How are they going to use it? And finally, we identify the best approach to change behavior. So you'll notice that this way of organizing learning is in reverse to what we typically do. We identify the activities that will achieve the greatest impact. And I'm going to use two concrete examples to identify how this is relevant to learning in groups and learning in organizations. So as I mentioned, we had the private sector development event, and some of the people who attended were managers, senior managers. They might go back and go to their team, say a sector team, and have a retreat to discuss, look, we want to incorporate this idea into our programming in future, and I would let, this is a behavior that I expect of you. Let's discuss as a group how we can integrate this and come to a common understanding. So in this case, the manager may want the task managers, the individual task managers, to design their project in a certain way. He considers their context. So they design projects according to different standards. He approves he serves as a filter for these projects going to other levels of management. So they decide as a group that this is how it's going to be done in future. He decides he wants to share this knowledge through a setting where they can all sit down and decide together. So say a retreat, and the retreat would be the way to impart this knowledge in this case. But let's look at something maybe on an organizational level. For example, one example of this would be the 2013 OPSCOM study of project design. So in response to chronic problems with portfolio quality, the OPSCOM Secretariat decided, look, maybe we need more information about implementation arrangements at the appraisal stage. So they identified that they wanted task managers to focus more clearly on implementation arrangements at this stage. But they also understood, when they considered the task managers in their context, that they're required to fill out an appraisal report with a certain structure. They're not required to provide this information as such. And they don't really have a lot of incentive, because the project might be approved anyways by the board. And also, they don't have a lot of time. So it's actually, in some ways, contradictory to their interest to spend a lot of time to make sure the implementation goes smoothly. Finally, they identified the approach to change behavior. In this case, the way that they did it was to provide a recommendation to the board and to senior management to say, look, we should have a separate document that's created called a project implementation manual. Had this recommendation been adopted, it would have changed behavior across the organization on a broad scale in terms of how we design and implement our projects. But it also brings up an important point, and this will be the end of my part of the presentation. When we're discussing learning and change in behavior, learning doesn't necessarily need to take place through an event or through a database or through a publication. It might be a good way to reach individuals to consider what kind of behavior we're trying to change. If we're trying to change a group or the behavior of an organization, we might decide a different, say, a retreat where we can all sit down and come to a common understanding. Or fundamentally, if it's about the organization, a formal change to the policies and directives along. In that case, you might just seek to lessons directly to senior management. But we need to think beyond through events, through publications, and through databases, and look at it in terms of what behavior we're trying to change and how to get there. So thank you very much for that part of, for hearing me out on how we can approach learning differently in organizations. I have a few questions for the individuals following this discussion, because we're all approaching from different contexts. So basically what I'd like to ask you is how we can make evaluation a bit more relevant to your work, how evaluation knowledge would be more accessible to you, when do you need it, and how should it be delivered? And how do we create incentives, in your opinion, to identify and to learn from failure? Or maybe failure is a bit strong, let's say things that didn't work as we expect. How do we create that incentive to discuss this openly and identify different ways of working? So please, it's a little bit challenging with the audio, so please type your questions into the chat box.
Either that.
Okay. Is anybody sending any?
Ruby va me faire signe dès qu'il revient du bord. Et Karen, oui, donc on va faire en même temps pour les Ruby, comme tu te fais.
So again, does anybody have any questions that they want to raise? Anybody in the chat box at all? Okay. Okay. So there is one question coming up. I'm just going to read it. So one individual is saying, I might not need the knowledge from one particular evaluation right now, but I need to find it when I need it, and timing is key. Okay. So in this case, first of all, we do have some tools available to task managers or managers within the bank, and that's the EVRD, the Evaluation Results and Lessons Database. And you can find this through the Organization Applications section of the intranet. Now, it does allow you to search the PCRs and the evaluations for different lessons. It shares the lessons and recommendations from evaluations. So if you are looking for knowledge about a particular topic, that is one route for you. However, we admit this is part of the reason why I've chosen to do this presentation, because we admit it's not a perfect way of doing it. Because if you don't know that the knowledge is out there, how can you use it? And also it might not be easily searchable. So this is one tool that is available, but admittedly we need to do a little bit better. But I think that this can be addressed through consultation between the different units of the bank and evaluation to say, look, these are the questions that we have. This is the knowledge that we need. What projects are coming up that can be useful? But for now, I think the best course of action is to find this information on the EVRD. But of course, we're always looking for ways to disseminate this information for exactly when people need it. So I'm going to move on to another question. So this is a colleague of ours in IDEV. So first, this starts with identifying the knowledge need correctly. This determines the utilization of this knowledge, hence the incentive to having that knowledge that could be applied immediately. And I absolutely agree with this. So we need to start our activities first by identifying the need and what kind of behavior what kind of behavior change we want to see. For example, one behavior change that I mentioned in the examples was to import a greater focus on implementation arrangements for projects before they're approved. So this was demonstrated in terms of a formal change to the requirements of the process, and sometimes that's necessary. But once we know what is the problem and how behavior needs to change to fix it, we can start looking into what kind of knowledge do we have to find a better way. So another question that's coming in. So on question 1, we need more relevance of knowledge and learning by focusing on how we can tackle country-level issues like bureaucratic bottlenecks and lengthy processes at the government level. Yes, we do need this. This is an interesting issue, and actually it's become increasingly relevant in the context of a new presidential directive, 02/2015, which basically says, you know, if a project is not eligible for first disbursement, if disbursement hasn't occurred within 6 months after approval, the project is eligible for a cancellation. And there's been a lot of problems in implementing this, and there are 2 reasons. First of all, it might not be relevant to all projects. For example, it might be a bit unreasonable for a large, complicated infrastructure project to disperse within the first 6 months. But also bureaucratic bottlenecks are very relevant. Each country has their own way of approving the loans, whether it be through political ratification or not. And so we need to have an understanding of the country's circumstances. On this point, one initiative that is being discussed right now is the idea of a country roadmap. For example, if we know that project implementation is always delayed in Cameroon because of the political process, or there were similar challenges, for example, in Ghana, where there was actually for a time a moratorium on new loans, how are we going to address this during the program or project design stage? to help ensure smoother implementation? How do we change our behavior in how we design projects to address this problem and achieve our current objectives better? So does anybody else have a comment or a question that they want to discuss? Okay. Okay, another very important point that has come up is that communication is key in the entire process, whether communicating with stakeholders or with participants. And yeah, I would personally agree with this fundamentally. In independent evaluation, as I mentioned, we're at a disadvantage because we're not involved. We're outsiders to a program or to a project. So we really have to communicate with both the stakeholders on the ground, but also the stakeholders in the country office to understand their context and to make sure that whatever we produce is fair and transparent to them, and also just relevant to their needs. There's no point in producing a credible evaluation if nobody's going to use it. If it's not used, then it's a report that sits on the shelf. This is something that we should avoid and try to avoid that through communication and through stakeholder engagement. Is there anybody else who has a comment or a question? And I guess we have 3 minutes, so last one, and then we'll wrap it up. Anybody? Okay, I think everybody has said what they would like to say or asked the questions that they would like to ask. You can always, if there is any issue that you want to discuss further, you can always reach me via my bank email, which is attached to the invitation. And I'd be happy to discuss this further with you. But thank you very, very much for attending this session. I hope it was useful and relevant to you. Thank you.
I'd like you all to thank our resource person, Erika, for that very thought-provoking, well-done presentation. Like I said, this is the second in the series of IDEV webinars. I would also like to thank you for spending an hour to participate and share your experiences with us. We will be sending a feedback form to you. Please, your feedback is important to us so that we can improve upon our webinars. We will be having more, and we will hope for your active participation. Thank you for your time.
Thank you. Okay, sorry, when you're writing